Kia ora tātou nai mai, haere mai. Good afternoon. My name's Sharron Lloyd. I'm the General Manager of the Circle here in New Zealand, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual event with our guest of honour, Antonia Watson, CEO of ANZ Bank here in New Zealand. Before I continue, I'd like to welcome all our guests dialing in from Australia and would like to acknowledge the original custodians of the land and pay respects to the elders, past, present and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes of Indigenous Australia. So welcome to all of you. I'd like to thank our series partners, CBA, IBM, ServiceNow and Red Hat. Thank you for your ongoing support. We can't do what we do without you. And I'm really pleased to welcome our partners of today's event, Conga, Pymetrics and Salesforce. We are thrilled to have on the call with us today, Grace Kerrison, who is VP and Managing Director of Asia Pacific for Pymetrics, Ramiz Gorgees, Territory Manager for ANZ at Conga, and Pip Marlow, Chief Executive Officer and Executive VP at Salesforce ANZ. I'm also thrilled to have a friend of the circle, James Brown, GM of FinTech New Zealand, as our moderator, and I will hand over to Grace now to start the formal proceedings.
Thank you, Sharron. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm Grace Kerrison, and I'm joining you today from Singapore. We're excited to partner with the Business Circle and in sponsoring today's session with Antonia. The topic of resilience and resilient leadership very much aligns to what we do and how we help companies. So a little bit about Pymetrics. We are an enterprise software as a service technology company that is transforming and challenging the status quo in the human capital space. Pymetrics partners and enables companies like ANZ, who have been on this journey with us for the last 2.5 years, to identify and develop a workforce that is adaptive, diverse, highly engaged, and productive. And we do this by making visible in a data-driven way their employees' potential based on their inherent behavioral makeup, which is really what we know as soft skills, so that they can be matched to the right opportunities. So may that be for reskilling or career development, or identifying teams and individuals to move from one function to another, or for recruiting someone into a role. Shane Elliott, ANZ's Group CEO, captured why this is important at an interview published last week. A key reflection he had over the past 6 to 8 weeks is that managers can fall into the trap of only seeing staff from the perspective of the role that they're in and not imagining them in a different part of the organization or tackling a bigger task. He calls that a crisis reveals the hidden gems in an organization. And in a timeline like this, you really see the people who can step forward. With Pymetrics, we capture unique behavioral data sets that is consistent and insightful so that the decisions about employees that leaders, managers, or HR have to make are more fair, objective, and transparent, and in turn will drive better business outcomes. What Shane described as a big shift for leaders and managers to view or evaluate people based on their potential. And our goal at Pymetrics is to keep enabling companies like ANZ achieve this shift with objective data and actionable insights on their workforce. And with that, I will hand over to Ramiz to introduce Antonia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Grace. Good afternoon, good morning all. My name is Ramiz Gorgees and I'm part of the Conga team here at ANZ. It gives Conga great pleasure to partner today's V-Event series with Antonia Watson. Antonia, it has been wonderful to see you in your role as Group Executive and CEO of ANZ New Zealand. You've had a substantial career with the bank, having previously held the role of Chief Financial Officer and Managing Director of the Retail and Business Banking arm. Over this time, we viewed you as someone who's warm, empathetic, and inclusive, a leader who's authentic. We appreciate your time today and can think of no one better suited to address the business community on the topic of resilient leadership. We certainly look forward to the conversations today. And guys, during this period, Conga has come together with our partner Salesforce and leveraged our digital document transformation suite to help support local not-for-profits get through this tough period. Together with Salesforce, we believe this is an excellent opportunity for our corporate partners, business and community leaders to join together to show resilient leadership and support their employees, their families, and the communities they operate in. And we know ANZ will be part of this leadership. I'll now hand over to our moderator, James Brown, to begin today's discussions. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ramiz, and great introduction, and welcome to everybody joining us in the session today. My name is James Brown. I'm the General Manager for FinTech NZ, and it gives me great pleasure to be part of the session, but also have the privilege of having a conversation with one of, obviously, our CEOs of one of the biggest banks here in New Zealand. Antonio, thanks for taking the time to join us. I appreciate, obviously, you've got a very busy schedule. And having said just at the start when we jumped on, you've sort of been in the CEO role, obviously, for a year, and I suppose to some extent what a year it's actually been. But before we sort of kick into the main session, though, I mean, I suppose I'd just like to get a thermometer check on, how have you coped with being away from sort of family and friends and, trying to just keep sort of physically fit, but also mentally fit as well, before we get into conversations around some of your customers as well.
Hi, James, and thank you. I haven't had a lot of time in the last 8 or 9 weeks to think about family and friends and that sort of thing, although it's been a lot of fun to be able to catch up with people on Zoom drinks and dinner. And in some ways, you end up seeing more of your neighbours because they're always out doing their bubble walks at the same time as you are. So it has been quite a deliberate, I'm in my spare bedroom, which is where I've been holed up for a long time, but quite deliberate that this is work and the other end of the corridor is home. And when I'm at home, I act the same way I would, so that might be still checking my emails from time to time, but it's not sitting down in front of the PC working in the way I would be if I was in the office and when I was at work. So that was quite an important distinction to make. The fitness took a bit of a dive when I had a small bike accident, so I was laid up for a little while, but trying to just keep out at least walking. But now the gym's back open, I'm absolutely delighted. And I think the other thing is just the resilience. And I mean, it's probably no surprise to most people on the call that I had a huge lesson in resilience last year. So that has stood me in very good stead for the times that we found ourselves over the last 8 or 9 weeks.
It's interesting. I mean, that word resilience, we are, we're certainly using it a lot more now potentially than we have been previously. From a business perspective, I mean, bearing in mind the size of the organization, the complexity of the organization, and we've had to sometimes react to things fairly rapidly, which is sometimes very difficult for big, large organizations. So in terms of that resilience thinking and being able to move and pivot to your customers' needs and demands, how have you and your sort of leadership team met that challenge?
I hope that we can bottle the speed at which things have been executed over the last period of time for business as usual. Whenever we get back to business as usual, it's been astonishing. I mean, we had 95% of our non-branch staff working from home within days. We'd started the process before we started hearing about the levels anyway, so that was a good head start. But the biggest success, I think, was getting our contact centres from home. I think 90% of them ended up being at home as well. And that then allowed us to repurpose people out of branches to help them. So the flexibility our staff showed was extraordinary, and the ability to make decisions, get people doing different roles, following where the demand was. Obviously, there was a huge amount of demand in our hardship team, and just answering questions from customers who were kind of scared, and that was fair enough at that point in time. We didn't know what we were facing into.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's when you're in situations, I suppose, where there is a crisis and there's elements of fear. It's actually having really clear guidance, that you can actually distribute far and wide, especially by the fact, obviously, of the size of your customer base. But in terms of, you mentioned your hardship team there. In terms of, where have you seen some opportunities for the organization? And do you actually think, because of the types of conversations you're having with your customers, it may actually indeed have brought you closer to them?
Absolutely. I think that we've, if you think back to, say, the GFC, banks were part of the problem then. And I think in this crisis, I hope and I think we are part of the solution. And the ability, right from the beginning, we looked at our customer base and we said, well, how can we help? And we sort of put it into 3 buckets. The first one was immediate relief, like passing on interest rate cuts and amending and reducing and removing some fees, all that sort of stuff, what we've done with contactless. There was some really immediate stuff there. Then moving on to how can we just go a step further, and that was the payment deferrals, which has been a spectrum. I mean, a lot of people have said, well, I don't really want a full deferral. It's still going to come back sometime, but maybe I go to interest only, or maybe I do take a payment deferral for 3 to 6 months just to see how things go. And we're already seeing the first people coming back on and saying, okay, I'm ready to start up again. So that immediate working capital sort of ability to get liquidity, whether you are a personal or a business customer, was really important. And then the next thing is new lending. Now that's been definitely a slower burn, both from we already had people only using 40% or so of their working capital facilities on average. That then went down because of the wage subsidy. So that was something that was incredibly helpful for liquidity in general. And then we're seeing people now just, I think we were in that sort of recover and rebuild stage. The end is a bit more in sight. We can see what business is emerging like. We're in level 2. People are starting to get the confidence to borrow again, and that will start to look like things like term lending and the business finance guarantee scheme.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it? It's that getting that confidence back to actually sort of, face into this now that we are on level 2, and I'm sure that, it won't be very long before we sort of go into level 1. In terms of from your position as the CEO and obviously the people that you report into you, have you found yourself adapting your style in any particular way throughout this? Because you are more remote now than possibly what you were before, and that face-to-face human contact, I think it's really interesting actually how much we miss that when we don't actually have the ability to do it. So I suppose I'm just curious to see if you've found an adoptive style has changed because of the sort of the forced remoteness of the situation we find ourselves in.
The need to keep in touch is huge. I mean, we've done our Zoom drinks and sort of ring up and check in on each other. Have had various WhatsApp groups that have been a really amazing way of keeping in touch. I think the thing that we've learned out of this, and I'll certainly take out of this, is being forced into not being able to do face-to-face communication in a time when communication has been incredibly important. We've probably been communicating more than ever. And, we had our annual budget breakfast with the Minister of Finance on Friday morning. We had a wider audience because we did it via Zoom than we would have if we'd had breakfast in a hotel in Wellington. So some of those things are actually really positive. So taking it doesn't always need to be face-to-face. And if it's not face-to-face and you can make it work, you actually cover more people and give more people the opportunity to ask questions. And something, there seems to be a less reluctance to ask the questions when it's not, you're not putting your hand up in a room, you're typing into a Q&A box on a screen. So I think learning from that going forward is going to be a really interesting change in the way we do things. And some things might be more suited now to webinars to get that extra coverage, to save people's time from driving or getting to wherever they needed to be or traveling. I think we will have learned from that.
Yeah, I think it's that we sort of like to almost eyeball each other when especially if we were talking about things that were very important or complex. It was having that ability to sort of gauge one's reaction. But I think you're absolutely right. Having the the technology at our disposal where we can actually reach far more people, probably more quickly now. And I think I've certainly found it interesting that you're actually busier during this time because we're not traveling to get to meetings. I'm not flying down to Wellington. You're not flying around the country. So it's almost a little bit back to back. But in terms of, you've been at the bank for over 11 years. You've been in the role for, just over a year. Has there been, like you mentioned the GFC as an example, was there things that you learned back then that you were able to deploy this time around, albeit slightly differently? And you mentioned obviously the bank's position in the GFC as to what their bank's position is now, but was the things that you'd learned there that you were easily to deploy to overcome some of the challenges that both the organisation and your customers were actually facing into?
I think when you think about this, it started off as a health crisis, so it was very different, and decision making becomes easier in a way when the huge overlay is always safety of your staff, of your customers. But I think the thing that we learnt from the GFC is the importance of funding, capital and liquidity for a strong and stable banking system, and how quickly it could all go wrong. And the position that we're in now via regulation and learning from our own mistakes allows us to be able to be part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem this time around. I mean, we've got incredibly strong balance sheets. We're in really good capital position. We've got the funding. The Reserve Bank's prepared to put up more if we need it. We're just not in that credit crunch. How on earth are we going to refinance our short-term borrowing position that we were back then? So it's a much nicer feeling coming in saying, well, we've saved for that rainy day. Now the rainy day's here. We've got that buffer that we can use to support our customers over this time.
Yeah, I think it's a very different position, absolutely. And you mentioned there in terms of small business, and obviously ANZ does an incredibly lot of work to help small businesses, but probably even more so now, I suppose, during this. In terms of moving to the sort of the future, what do you actually think the future is going to look like in terms of, that engagement with your customers and, the needs and the demands from their own businesses? Because, you mentioned cash, and generally cash flow is king. Do you see there being, the opportunity for possibly new products or new solutions to come out of this as well from a banking perspective?
I think that the change, in some ways, it's not going to be any different than the change that was already happening. Some of it will be accelerated, and I think that change is the digital tools and the ability to use our data at scale to help our customers. We're still in early days of really being able to look across our entire customer base, from things like a product suitability sense, from a how can we help you with, here's your behavior around coming into a branch or using our digital tools. Did you know there's a better way of doing that? So I think it's still continuing that journey, but hopefully in some way in the last few weeks we've been able to accelerate it, knowing which of our customers we needed to contact because they had signed up for internet banking but had never used it and therefore weren't in a position to do their banking, knowing which of them hadn't signed up at all, knowing which ones that were confident and therefore we didn't need to bother. All those little data-driven decisions that you can make when you can really properly know your customer base in a way that we never used to be able to. The way we used to be able to was a face-to-face bank manager role, and the scale of society now, you can't have that relationship with every single customer and don't need to.
Yeah, I remember a conversation actually with another CEO about the stance they were taking on checks. And it was very interesting that I was on a news radio show talking about that the transition from cash and checks into sort of more digital products. And then lo and behold, only a few weeks later, then we all find ourselves in a position where actually, we don't have the option of using checks or cash. Generally, it was contactless payments. In terms of the speed that the banks and everybody involved in the conversation to move from what was a contactless threshold, $80, to then move that obviously quite significantly. And if you compare that to the UK, where I think they went from £30 to £50, which probably didn't really have much of a positive impact. Do you think that going forward that limit might stay for a little while? It could stay indefinite? I mean, what's your thoughts there?
Well, the concern about raising a limit is always fraud, and that's what we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at, it certainly wasn't something we put in forever, it was something we put in to monitor. And it will depend on if we see a higher incidence of fraud now that there are more retailers open, there's more people around, and that's what we'll be monitoring along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think cyber and scams, I would imagine, is probably a conversation that yourself and your leadership team have on a reasonably regular basis. But it's certainly, when I've spoken to the ecosystem, there's definitely been an uptake, which is really unfortunate. But I do think that we're fairly well covered in terms of data and be able to sort of analyze out exactly where there may be some vulnerabilities. In terms of decision making, I mean, if you found yourself, it's always a challenging role anyway, but has there been any decisions that sort of stick out in your mind that, that was just a really, really difficult thing to do during, obviously, this current COVID situation?
Probably not. And the reason for that is because of that health and safety overlay that went on everything. It made, listen to the advice from the Ministry of Health. helped make all the decisions. Probably one of the harder things was very early on, we'd decided as a group, ANZ, to long before this was anyone's rule or requirement or advice, to cancel events with more than 20 people. And I was feeling terrible about that. I was thinking, all these people who have signed up to our events and all the work that's gone into them. And then I sort of stood back and thought, well, do we want to be the cluster? So even though, you put that health overlay of on those decisions, and they suddenly become quite easy.
And obviously, looking to your footprint, obviously both here and in Australia, well, actually around the globe, but staying closer to home just for the moment. I mean, with the speed of which you were able to deploy people into working remotely, do you see that there's going to be some conversations around the business about how much of that may remain? Even the possibility that people might be a little bit mindful of coming back into a working environment. So do you see that there may be some further conversations around branched networks, footprints, and that type of thing, or is it too early to go down that path?
Oh, definitely. I think we don't know exactly what it looks like, and it's something we'll talk to staff about, and it's certainly not something we're looking to do is require people to work from home for the long term or anything. It'll be more around what suits people. I think a lot of people, myself included, have realised exactly what you can accomplish being at home compared to being at the office, and sometimes you lose some productivity, and we certainly had staff you could tell were feeling a little bit bad about that, and making them understand that that was one of those things. But then on the other hand, you've had people who've been a lot more productive. I mean, you talked about travel. I mean, suddenly all the social events and the travel went away, and I'll sort of look a bit nostalgically back on that time when I could do nothing but be at home. And so I think we already have hot desking allowing for the fact that we never have more than 60-something% of our staff in the office pre-COVID. That number's likely to go down, so that's likely to impact what our footprint might look like going forward, and it will just take time and looking at the data to determine what that looks like.
And in terms of mental health and well-being, I mean, has there been any statistical analysis in people using some of the tools that are available during this time, because they're feeling a little bit uneasy about just obviously the current situation? Have you noticed anything of that nature?
I mean, certainly not. I don't have any stats to hand, but it's been something we've been really wary of, and making sure that leaders are checking in and that we've had the tools available for our staff. And there's definitely there's degrees of people who just can't wait to get out of the house, and people who are kind of nervous, or people who were coming back. And if you think about the beginning of level 4, and we opened branches 3 hours a week, if you were the person that was, everyone else in New Zealand's in lockdown and you're going to open a branch, but once they realised what the PPE looked like, and we had the screens that they could be behind, you get that degree of comfort. And what I see now is on our internal intranet pages how much fun some of those groups of people had in their branches over the course of the lockdown. So it's it's time and understanding individuals have different responses, and we just had to look out for those.
And in terms of productivity, because I mean, at the end of the day, you are still a business, and we do obviously have to be very mindful of everybody in the current situation. But have you taken a particular view that, if people are working from home, or they're working a little bit more remotely, we are not always aware of what they're doing? Have we just taken an adult approach to this, and
yep.
We've got to trust our people to do that? Is that how you would approach that?
Absolutely, that's been trust, and it's also been a bit of a message that don't sweat it if you feel like you are being a little bit less productive as well. We're in pretty challenging special times, and as I said, for some people who couldn't quite get the work done that they could have because of their environment, or they were homeschooling their kids, or whatever that was, there were some that were making up for it because the environment had suited them better. So it was whatever worked for individuals.
Yeah, I think that's a really sensible approach. It's interesting. So we talk a lot about that sort of productivity piece, and being able to actually manage more of the output sometimes rather than the input that some industries in the past have done. In terms of your strategy then, or ANZ's strategy moving forward post-COVID, is there going to be any particular part of the business? It's just a question that's come in. Is there going to be any particular part of the business that you're going to really focus on, or do you sort of see it a little bit more still business as usual?
It was probably more business as usual. There'll certainly be a lot of customers that we'll have to focus on a lot because, you know, well, that can't sugarcoat that there are going to be business failures. There are going to be people that are really struggling for a period of time. So, you know, that's the usual, you know, banks saving up for the rainy day and the good times. That's what we usually expect in recessions or in economic tough times. And so that's what we do. So that will definitely be a change, as some of that individual customer focus of customers who are not in the position that they were pre-COVID.
And if we're thinking about technology and the fact that we have moved more remote, we're using probably maybe more digital tools now than possibly what we have previously. Do you see the continuation in possibly even more speed around large organizations like yourselves working with smaller organizations to deploy more streamlined processes to your customers, or even indeed actually just giving them access to products that possibly someone else has developed beyond obviously what's in the market? Do you see more of that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've all gone from as big banks, we've gone from a place of being worried about the disruption of, say, fintechs or the smaller organizations to actually how can we partner with them. You know, no one actually wants to, none of the, you know, nimble, agile, smaller organizations with a great idea, none of them want to be the next big bank when you really think about it. They're not looking to be us. We don't often have the flexibility to be able to, you know, sit at home in our computers and come up with some great new idea. And the idea that those two can fit nicely together in a partnership, I think, is well and truly in train. And that's the sort of thing that you see us doing now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to go back 3 or 4 years ago when I think the fintech sort of came onto the scene as the fresh young kids, and it's, you know, they sort of wanted to be more of the disruptor, but I think the realization that actually one works really well with the other. You know, they may have obviously a really cool product or solution, but actually you've got customer base, the distribution channels and so forth. So I think that's been a really, really nice journey to have seen organizations on both ends of the spectrum go through. In terms of regulation throughout through COVID, do you think the government and the regulators, like the RBNZ you mentioned earlier on, and Adrian, looking at the capital requirements and pushing stuff like that out, do you think they've played a really good role in just keeping that very much, you know, the doors open, let's have a conversation? Yep. Or do you think that there's more that we could be doing as a nation?
I think it's been, I'd say, a real partnership between government, regulator, banks over the last couple of months, and the speed at which decisions were made and relief was given that allowed us to focus on the immediate impact of COVID on our customers, as opposed to whatever the next compliance project that we had going. I mean, they're all the right things to be doing, and they will all get done, but now there were other things that were, and so it was extraordinary. There was things that we'd get a letter from the Reserve Bank saying you don't need to do this, and we're thinking, oh, we'd forgotten about that one. Thank you. So it was a really good partnership, and I think that, you know, we continue to talk to them. We continue to talk with Treasury about what can be done. So there's really good open dialogue, and the NZBA has been excellent as well in sort of corralling the various banks together to make sure that we've got that industry voice with government and the regulator.
Yeah, I think Roger and his team, I think, do a really good job. In terms of looking at then Australia and New Zealand, I mean, do you see, in terms of how the businesses operate, and especially through this period of time, has there been anything that you've learned from each other that you've been able to then sort of utilize and deploy, or are both strategies fairly well aligned?
They're fairly well aligned, but we have been learning from each other and have been talking to each other all the way through. New Zealand's lockdown terminology ended up working quite well for the Australian business. We've had slightly different technology bases that has meant that you know, day-to-day operations have been a bit different. For example, their contact centre is still in the office, so they've had to spread out their offices to allow for that. But just the ways that those are done, how we get people back into the office. So we were talking about it earlier, just before this, we started the call. there's a real logistics in that, getting people through lifts, getting people through the pinch points of the doors, what happens in your kitchen. So a lot of that stuff we've really shared on. And I think the two countries have had a very similar experience in general of COVID, which we both seem to be coming out of, touch wood, nicely. And I hope that's a really good opportunity for us.
Yeah, it's probably not really the platform to talk about how other countries have maybe approached COVID, and I won't mention the UK or the US. Oh, but I just did. But no, I mean, I think you're right. It's and I think, you know, the conversations that we're having at the moment around the Trans-Tasman bubble and things of that nature will definitely help stimulate the economy, because, you know, I think the beauty of this is actually that, you know, the New Zealand and the Australian relationship is such that, you know, I think we'll only get stronger as both nations through this. I think, which will be a really good thing. So if you had a crystal ball then, in terms of helping to drive economic growth over, let's say, the next 12 months, what sort of things would you like to see come out of the back of this, either from an organizational perspective, or maybe new legislation to help spin companies up that can then deploy new products and solutions into global markets?
Ooh, I think that I don't have all the answers there, but I think we've got this incredible opportunity because we hopefully will be in a better position than many countries from a health perspective, and therefore an economic perspective quicker, let's hope. So let's not stuff it up. And that will allow us to, you know, I think will be an attractive place to be, to invest. I hope we don't close the doors to, you know, new generation investment of, you know, that can help us prosper in a new, more digital economy. Help us gather some of the skills that we're probably lacking compared to some markets. So I think that would be incredibly helpful. I think using that opportunity. What does tourism look like in the future? I mean, we're still going to be a beautiful country, and we have control over our borders, which has been an advantage. And personally, there were a lot of tourists, and parts of New Zealand weren't becoming so attractive. So how do we turn that into a more sustainable industry going forward? I acknowledge how tough it is on tourism operators at the moment, but I also know from talking to people that people are desperate to get out, come out and see our country. So I really hope that that's something that we see in terms of domestic tourism taking off, and people doing things and going places when they might have previously gone to somewhere else in the world.
It's interesting, I suppose, when I arrived in New Zealand and sort of found out that actually, you know, we were the first country in the world to actually create a refrigerated ship, because back then, obviously, geography was actually something that challenged us. Whereas now the sentiment is actually, because of our geographical location and the way that obviously COVID's been managed, that actually people will start to look at this as a destination, not only to possibly even relocate themselves and their family, but also maybe some parts of their investment portfolio. And that was the interesting thing when we were in the UK in September, speaking to the UK government, and how some of their fairly wealthy individuals were actually, you know, very much New Zealand was becoming on the radar. So in terms of, you know, some of it, they talked about technology and, you know, ANZ's position in both the Australian market and the New Zealand market. Do you think New Zealand's maybe got the ability now actually to use this as a catalyst to drive good outcomes in terms of, you know, attraction of more talent and more investment, because of the way that actually we've got through this?
You bet. I mean, number one, people have heard about us that probably didn't hear so much about New Zealand before. But number two, go back to your refrigerated ship. We are innovative. We do get some stuff. We do get things done. There is that can-do attitude, and you know, you can see the attitude. You know, the people protesting in various parts of the rest of the world. I mean, New Zealand, we had good communication, and people got on with it over the level 2 and level 3 time frame. So I think if we have that, bottle that attitude, keep it going, I think, you know, and come out of this a bit earlier than other countries, I think there are all sorts of things that could be for our advantage.
And I very much agree with you. I think that the regulators have taken you know, I mean, let's be honest, this has been a really difficult situation for everybody. but I think having the ability to affect change at speed, I think, is definitely been a big help. And certainly from my point of view, we want to continue to have some of those conversations, and I'm sure you as an organisation will continue to do that as well. But in terms of, in terms of our economy, do you think that we're going to keep resilient? We're going to have enough cash in the bank to really help support the sort of the startup and the tech industries, through this, because we still don't know to some extent how long we might be in these lockdown levels as we go through. But do you, going back to your opening point, you think we're well positioned to do that?
I do. I think that, I mean, if you take the position we're in going into this as a country, strong banks for starters, but the government in a very good fiscal position, the Reserve Bank still with monetary policy up their sleeves, and we've got very low interest rates now, but they can go lower, and there's certainly been no hesitation with quantitative easing. I think, we're all, our eyes are watering a little bit at the idea of net government debt at 50% of GDP, but let's not forget that there are countries that started this in a way worse position. So, and interest rates are extremely low, so the cost of that will be low. So we just need the growth that will help pay it off. So I do think that, there's nowhere else in the world I'd rather be right now, frankly.
And I think, yes, I mean, I do find it interesting when you put the news on sometimes, and obviously they're talking about two very public figures in Donald and Boris. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there'll be people all over the world who have been very glad to be in New Zealand and possibly other countries as well. But yeah, I mean, I think we did just get on with it. We may not have liked, the sort of the demand or the forced nature of, being at home and being in lockdown and being in isolation. But I think collectively everybody actually took it on the chin and just did the job. And I think that's exactly why we're in the position that we're in. Which will stand us in good stead, and I think that we'll get through this relatively unscathed to some extent. And some sectors obviously will find it harder than others, but I think what we're already hearing as well is that people are having the ability to pivot. And you mentioned, in terms of some of your staff and pivoting from working in the office to then working from home, but even pivoting roles, and maybe through this, learning new skills and actually deploying some of that expertise into a different part of the organization, which helps the organization, helps the customers, and obviously helps them. So I think it's going to be really interesting going forward. But just before, I think we've got maybe just a couple more minutes. In terms of some of the other players in the market, do you think there may be the opportunity, and whether it will be welcomed or not, that there might be some consolidation in the financial services sector, so that people will actually, be able to get through this together?
I think we're very well served by an extremely competitive financial services sector. Thanks, James.
Yeah, no, I think we're in a good position. But yeah, I'm just trying to look to see if there are any other questions that we haven't covered off, because we've had quite a few, which I've gone through as best as we possibly can. But no, I think we're pretty good. So yeah, I mean, any final thoughts from you about other things that from an organisational perspective that you see will opportunities throughout this, or is it just let's get back into the office and just get on with it?
I guess in the last word, I mean, in general, I'm an optimist. There's going to be some really tough times ahead. Our chief economist, Sharron said, we might be lucky and end up just with a regular horrible recession. And I think that's probably undoubted. So it's not going to be easy, but I do think there are opportunities. But let's just not stuff it up right now. Let's keep being careful, because let's not forget this started as a health crisis, and we've got to solve that health crisis. Very
well said. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to hand over to Pip, just to say a few words, just to come to the end of the session. Over to you, Pip.
Great, thanks, James, and thanks to both of you. A really amazing discussion, and not just around banking, but certainly around leadership and and taking care of the country. So on behalf of Salesforce, it gives me great pleasure to thank you, Antonia, for today's briefing. Before I get into that, I just remind you all that you are seeing your business sentiment poll pop up on your screen in front of you. We would love you to take some time now to answer that as we go through, and then at the end, I think Sharron will give you a bit of an update on how we did across the sentiment. So incredible points. It started, I reckon, at the beginning around talking about resilience, and we talked a little bit before we kicked off with the panelists earlier. You can't get a course to teach you resilience, really, at the end of the day. Your experience probably before this pandemic has set you in good stead for getting through this, as well as the GFC. But we will use this as an incredible resilience building opportunity. And the focus on what you can control. Nobody asked for this crisis, and it is a health crisis, but nobody wants to waste it. And I think what you shared is some myths have been busted through how we've been able to adapt from our customers' expectations, consumers and businesses. Their acceptance of digital and online and different ways of work has actually moved very quickly. Our employees, you talked about working from home. I think it's pretty clear work is a thing you do, not a place you go. Now, when you do want to go into the office, what does that future of work look like? When do you need to be face-to-face? When do you need to collaborate or have certain systems in place? I think that whole world is going to evolve, quite a lot over the next period as we redefine that and redefine the skills that we need to operate in that. So a huge amount of work, I think, across organizations as you think about moving forward. But I also really loved your conversation about clarity of the principles that helps you make a decision. And it was very clear in how ANZ response was the health and well-being. It's a health crisis, and that means we will make decisions that keep the health and well-being of our employees and our customers at the centre. And I know how you felt when you talked about cancelling events. We cancelled our world tour, which is about 10,000 people across Australia and New Zealand, 10 days out in early March. And in many ways, it was a heartbreaking because everybody put so much in to prepare for it. But actually, when you say health and well-being is the number one thing, it makes the decision simple, as you said. So I think a huge opportunity to think about clarity of decision-making. We've learned a lot about that through this crisis. And you talked about how do we take the best of it forward. And I 100% agree. What organisations like ANZ has done at such speed, I mean, many people just didn't think what was possible could be possible, but you've proven that you can drive at speed and still manage risk. Thinking about sustainability into the future, your conversation around tourism, how do we make sure we create that sustainable future is a huge opportunity for us to focus on what we can control. And I personally am really looking forward to that ANZ bubble being merged, because then I think we can each explore our own backyards across Australia and New Zealand, because Aussies and Kiwis, we love to travel the world, but actually our countries are so amazing. And I come with great bias because, as I shared with Antonia before, I'm a Palmerston North girl, and I've been pretty proud of how New Zealand has shown up on the world stage right now. I'm keen to get back and see my family over in New Zealand. So I'm looking forward to our bubbles merging. So with that, thank you again, Antonia. I thought you brought incredible insight. James, you really facilitated that beautifully to help bring that to life. So thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Sharron, who's going to take us through the poll answers and give you a little bit of an idea of how the collective sentiment is. Beautiful. Thank you so much, Pip. So I do have the poll results now that should be in front of you. So 66% of us feeling innovative, which is brilliant. 79% believe the government is doing a good job during this pandemic. Estimate of when it will be over, majority believe 12 months. And thank you so much, 98% of you joining us believe that the event met your objectives today, which is brilliant. So just in closing, I'd like to thank our series partners again, CBA, IBM, ServiceNow and Red Hat, and of course all of our wonderful support partners here today, Conga, Pymetrics and Salesforce. Thank you to all of you for being with us today. And Antonia, I think you gave us kind of the final words, but I'll hand over to you perhaps just to say goodbye and wrap us up.
Don't stuff this up, New Zealand. Let's put ourselves in a position that we can take some opportunity out of what's been an awful time, is going to continue to be, but we're well placed, so let's not stuff it up.